Welcome to Step Into a Story. We are here today for episode number 6 with Malve von Hassell, the author of The Amber Crane and several other books. Malve von Hassell was born in Italy and spent part of her childhood in Belgium and Germany before moving to the United States. She's a freelance writer, researcher, and translator, and holds a Ph.D. in anthropology from the New School for Social Research. She edited her grandfather Ulrich von Hassell's memoirs written in prison in 1944 before his execution for opposing the Nazis. She has self-published a children's picture book, her translation and annotation of a German children's classic, a historical fiction novel for young adults, and more. Her forthcoming book, actually it's out now, isn't it?
Yes, that's correct.
The Amber Crane, I grabbed this off your page and I didn't think to update it that it is out. The Amber Crane is set in Germany in 1645 and 1945. Currently, she is working on a biographical work about a woman coming of age in Nazi Germany. So welcome, Malve. It is a pleasure to have you for episode number 6. So can you tell us just a brief overview of The Amber Crane?
Thank you, Laura. It's a pleasure to be here. The Amber Crane is a time slip novel. In other words, it is historical fiction that is essentially real and possible with an element of time slip fantasy to connect the two time frames. And it is set in 1644-45 and 1944-45. And both those periods were the tail ends of major wars, World War II on one end and the 30 Years' War on the other. And I was interested in a time slip novel where the characters return in time, but instead in this moves from the 17th century to the 19th century and experiences a world that is totally outside of anything he had ever seen. And I framed the story around a landscape that I have known through the stories of my mother. And setting is Pomerania, which is a historical region today, partly in Poland and partly in Germany. And in the time when my mother lived there, it was all Germany. And the two time periods that one needs to know about, the 30 Years' War and World War II, were both extremely destructive in that particular region of the world. And the main character is a young man or a boy, 15 years of age, who is a member he's an apprentice in the Amber Guild. And amber was one of the main products, commodities that was produced and crafted and traded in Pomerania and from Pomerania all over Europe and Asia Minor. That's sort of a very of the book.
Okay, and yeah, it's
and Peter, the main, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Peter, the main character, experiences both the 30 Years' War and World War II, and learns that in many ways war is the same, regardless of which time period. And he's also amazed by some of the things he experiences in World War II in that time period. And since the setting is his own world, he also sees what happens in that, in his home 300 years into the future. And he ends up helping a young woman whom he meets in his time travels. And the story involves evacuation because people in the tail end of World War II fled from the oncoming Soviet army and tried to get to the West. And as time passed, it became increasingly difficult and increasingly challenging. And the young boy and ultimately provides a key for her escape. And At the same time, in his own environment, he faces problems with his own actions in that he picked up a piece of amber he was not allowed to have, which created all sorts of problems, not only for himself, but for his amber guild master and for his family. And I throw into it the possibility of a witchcraft accusation, and it ends up with, at the end, at which point innocence is at risk. He is afraid of getting, at the very least, banned from his home, which is one of the punishments imposed on people illegally collecting amber, since amber was an extremely controlled substance.
Yeah. Right. And it sounds like you chose amber for this story because it was such a big product from that era in that time frame. So how did you learn about all these properties of amber that you discuss in the book?
I researched them. I grew up on stories about amber and have always been fascinated by amber. Mm-hmm. And amber, the various legends around amber are things that we read when we were kids and grow in Germany. So it was always part of my frame of mind.
Okay, right. And I think from what I read at the end of your book, you use an awful lot of your actual family history in here, right? Like the manor that you describe her going to at the end of the book. That was actually a family home, wasn't it?
It was my mother's maternal family's home. And she spent much of her childhood there. And a lot of the descriptions are stories that I have heard. And I also was fortunate enough in visiting that particular area and actually stepping inside the home where she was born in 1994, after it became easier for us to travel to that part of the world. And
was it in the Eastern Bloc?
It was in Poland.
Okay.
It was formerly Germany, but that portion of Pomerania became Poland.
Okay. Yeah.
And it was
so neat when I read the end of the book and realized how much of it is actually your family history, that even the linden tree you talk about actually exists. And so it was a really neat touch to this story to realize even little tiny details. You're not making it up. I mean,
no.
Even Peter, for all I know, he was actually your ancestor. So you have a reading prepared for us. Do you want to?
I would love to. I would love to read a little bit of an excerpt from chapter 1. And in chapter 1, he starts walking on the beach and he is angry and he's disgruntled and he's frustrated with his life. So I am starting in the middle, basically. Peter pulled his coat tighter around himself against the wind. Occasionally, he stepped into a depression filled with water, but it did not bother him. The sound of the waves soothed him. He felt as if he could breathe more easily. He dreaded the weight of his father's unhappiness, the lingering sadness over his brother's death, and the weaving and rocking from side to side his sister engaged in when she was upset. There was no room for Peter in any of this. To get out of the wind for a while, Peter crawled into a little hollow beneath exposed roots of a stand of scraggly pine trees. Riding along a path on top of the dunes, the beach watchman would patrol the area, on the lookout for people gathering amber. The tide was going out, but the sea was churned up by the storm, and gusts of wind continued to whip across the water. Occasionally, the spray from breakers hitting the beach tickled his face, and his lips tasted salty. The smell of the sea and the incessant slap of the waves onto the shore gave him a feeling of being worlds away from Master Novak's disapproving frown or his father's gloomy dissatisfaction. Absorbed in watching the shimmer of the water and the glow of the setting sun, he felt his thoughts calm down. Escape from all this. He began a dream of journeying far away. It would be marvelous to come upon a hidden cache of amber somewhere along the fabled amber beaches. Of course, he knew there was nothing more unlikely. He thought of the tales told by amber fishers who claimed to have seen large chunks of amber floating in the waves when reaching out with their nets at all. Peter ran his hand back and forth, the exposed gnarly pine roots near his legs, then stopped, wincing. He had cut the sensitive area between thumb and index finger. Thumping sounds made him raise his head. The silhouette of a horse and rider loomed against the darkening sky. The beach watchman cantering along the path. Peter squeezed farther, his foot digging into the sand. Reverberated as the rider thumped past his hiding place, sliding down as if a sinkhole had opened up beneath him. Peter grabbed onto an exposed pine tree root to keep from making noise and attracting the watchman's attention. The horse started and snorted, as if sensing Peter's presence. The rider cursed, kicking the horse, and within moments passed by. The sounds of the hoofs in the sand faded away. Peter was still clutching the root with one hand when he felt a lump underneath the other. Slowly, he sat up and tried to pull his find out of the sand, tugging until it was free. He shook it to dislodge some of the sand. The clump smelled bad. It was nothing but rotted netting with barnacles and small shells caught in its toils. Disappointed, he raised his hand to toss it away. Then Peter hesitated. The dark, stringy strands reminded him of the nets used by the amber catchers. He could feel something firm inside the twisted mess of rope and knots, and worked his fingers into the tangle, pushing and pulling until he was able to pry it apart. A salt-crusted stone with a rough, cracked surface fell onto the sand in front of his feet. He picked it up to take a closer look. There actually were two pieces. A longer one, about the length of his palm, curved around a smaller one, like a mother cradling a baby in her lap. When he prodded the clump with a little twig, the pieces came apart. These were not stones. They were too light. Amber. Instinctively, Peter closed his hands over his find and glanced around to see whether the watchman was coming back. The tops of the distant pine trees waved in the wind. The beach was deserted, and the only sound other than the surf was the raucous screeching of the cranes. After a moment, Peter relaxed, opening his hands to study the lumps. Dull, crusted with salt, unpolished, they did not look at all appealing. But he had worked with Master Novak long enough to know at least one of them to be a unique and unusually large piece of amber. On the amber market, it would fetch a high price. The smaller piece was just large enough for a lady's pendant. Peter could see it with his mind's eye, as clearly as if he had spent a perfect little heart. Dark golden glow. He put it down and picked up the other one. It was almost as long as his hand and half as wide in the middle. In the workshop, he rarely handled or worked on pieces larger than those used to make rosary beads. He poked at the crusty surface with his fingernail. He turned it this way and that. It made him think of a tall bird, perhaps a crane. Its oblong shape seemed curiously as if a bird was waiting underneath the crust inside its dark golden nest. He should throw it back. Someone might have seen him walking toward the beach. It would be awful if he were caught. He would have to count himself lucky if he only got flogged. He should throw everything back into the sea immediately. The watchman might come circling back any moment. He closed his hand firmly on his find and lifted his arm. Then, as if pulled down by a tremendous weight, his arm dropped. Just for a night. He would keep it just for a night. Tomorrow he would take it back.
I like that reading a lot. It really drew me in at the beginning of the book. Now, you referenced earlier that this is kind of a time slip. Can you tell for those listeners who don't know, what is the difference between time slip and time travel?
I'm sorry, I heard only a portion of this.
Yeah,
let me explain how
the internet connection isn't the greatest today. For those who not know, can you tell the difference between time slip and time travel?
This may be my faulty use of language. By time slip, I mean one character that through a magical element ends up slipping back and forth and experiencing two time frames at the same time. So I suppose it is time travel. I'm not sure if I'm able to distinguish between those two. I probably should have researched those terms more carefully.
Well, you know, it's interesting because there actually is a phenomenon called time slips that different, and you can find some of these stories online, and that's why I thought you knew about these, because some of the elements you describe are actually what these people describe. So for instance, there's one of these stories is about this, I think it was a pair of couples who were traveling, and they stopped in this wonderful little French town where everybody seemed kind of very quiet and aloof, and, you know, but they bought a handkerchief and they moved on, and it was such a wonderful place. They said, let's stay there on the way back. And they couldn't find this town again. And when they did some research, they were told that town hasn't been there for, you know, like decades. It's gone.
Yeah.
But one of the elements of these time slip stories, and these supposedly are true stories, you know, they're things that people only kind of tell years later. They're like, yeah, this really weird thing happened to me. But you use that element in the beginning of this book where her voice is very muffled. And at first it sounded very much like these time slip stories as opposed to, you know, going fully and completely into another time.
Yeah, in a way, to me, it is, then I suppose I use the term time slip correctly. It's my laziness for not.
Yeah. Except that the longer the book.
For me.
Yeah, I found it interesting that he stays more and more in the time, and her voice is no longer far away, and things become more real and more solid the more he's.
Yeah, I actually meant to have it as if he was watching a movie, even though he had never watched a movie before. And initially it was all black and white and flat. And as he kept drawn more and more into that world, eventually he even started seeing colors, and it was less flat, while his own world started to become less real to him. And part of him, he was no longer able to quite distinguish between one reality and another, and felt fragmented, and yet really driven to go back and experience that world in the future, even though he could not comprehend it.
So did you research some various theories of time travel for this?
No.
Okay.
I did not.
Yeah, I find it fascinating, and I usually ask time travel authors this because a lot of scientists have actually theorized ways it could be possible and ways it might happen, and so how time really behaves. So I think it's particularly interesting that you just jumped in and did it your way. And so why did you choose to use, like, some time travel uses a machine, a lot of them use portals, like my own books, they go into a castle. And this particular tower seems to have some quality about it that shifts people around in time. You know, it's like a thin space. But you chose an object. Why did you go that route?
Sorry.
Why did you go?
Okay, some of that got lost.
Okay, that's okay. Why did you choose using an object as what moves people around time?
Because it's all about love. He fell in love with Amber, and he knew he was doing something he wasn't supposed to be doing. And the Amber took hold of his mind. And it seemed a very easy way to link the two time frames. Because again, as a child, we had pieces of amber. We heard about amber. amber's magical qualities were always spoken about. In the various legends, amber has all sorts of powers, or people believe that it had all sorts. It seemed a fairly obvious way story around that and around his fascination with amber. And initially, he has no idea what is causing these strange dreams, as he thinks they are.
Right.
And does not make the connection. It takes him quite a while to make the connection between the amber crane. And as he is carving it, as it becomes more visible in real life, he's also drawn further and further into that world.
So I was curious, and I was trying to go through my notes so I could do these more in order, and I can't find the question, so I'm just going to ask it any way and, not ask to get to it. Why did you choose not only two wars, but sort of relatively speaking, the end period of those two wars?
Partly because I, as a child, always heard all the stories about the evacuation. And I lived with it. I obsessed about the feeling of going away, losing a piece of your home, and fairly certainly knowing that you would never come back. And I also obsessed about the horses and the treks, and that period was incredibly dramatic. You have to visualize hundreds of thousands of people with carts drawn by horses, tracking through a winter landscape at great risk and over long distances. And I had heard so many of these stories that partly I wanted to, I guess, work strange coincidence that there were exactly 300 years between those two periods that I talk about. And there seemed to be very distinct parallels between the two wars, and that neither one of them made any sense. Ultimately, they were both horrific. The population suffered greatly, and ultimately the population couldn't care less anymore who it was as long as it would end.
You brought that out really, really well, that they were just to the point of, it doesn't even matter if the soldiers are on our side or not on our side, they're destroying us anyway. Which kind of brings me to this very interesting point you brought out, that these people of the town, they don't bother to take care of their houses anymore because, every time they do, they just get destroyed and burned again anyway. And yet, on the other hand, they still make, half of them have died. I mean, a full of the town has died in the past, 27 years so far that this war has been going on. And yet they still gather for All Hallows Eve. They still put on plays. How do you as an author, or how should other authors, get into the minds and psyches of people who have lived for 27 years with constant death and warfare to understand this dichotomy where you don't take care of your house and yet you joyfully gather for plays and bonfires?
Yeah, I think for me personally, I'm not sure how to advise others, but for me personally, it was based on the stories I've heard from my mother, who lived through years of war and then years of Russian occupation, because she happened to be in the East Zone at the end of the war. So she lived under Russian occupation. And she spent many of those years starving and frightened and living with constant bomb warning. Yet, she said, those were very good times. And this sounds very bizarre. She had lost her brother, she had lost her father, she had lost her first husband, she had lost many of her friends. And yet, people clung together. The friends that still were there were generous and cheerful. other. When somebody had carrots, they said, come over, we have carrots to eat. They had parties. My mother described some of the crazy parties they had in the middle of disaster. And my mother always said, I asked her, how did you do this? And she said, when you're in the situation, you live and you have to make the best of it and you get through it. And yes, she would say, what's the point of cleaning the staircase? Because the bomb might come this week at the end of the week. Why bother doing chores? I'll wait until the end of the week before the building actually gets bombed. On the other hand, they also did have a good time.
Right. Well, and it's interesting.
Realistic.
Because next week's guest is Ilona Peronikova, I think I said that right. And she actually grew up in a communist country, and she talks about how they were actually very happy in many ways. And in my own book, a modern musician ends up in medieval times, and he says at one point to Neil, his friend in medieval times, you are living in such a horrible, awful, brutal time. It's nonstop war. People are dying all the time. If England catches you, they're going to torture you horribly. How come you're so happy? And he's like, I might be dead tomorrow. I have time to be miserable. And what you're saying reminds me of that there really, it's a mindset we don't expect when we live a pretty good life here. So, and